Well, good morning, everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are listening at this particular time. Welcome to the MOJOE.studio podcast. I'm here with my good friend, John Comfort, and this is the first time we're going live, and so we hope that people will jump in, join in. Feel free to post a comment, and as it flows in the conversation, we'll be happy to address those as well. This is live now in video and audio form, and then we will take the audio out of it and add it to the MOJOE.studio podcast. And this conversation with John is a continuation. This is like episode 5, I think, or 6 for us, number 6 for us. Yeah. It's been a really excellent journey so far, and it really is, it's a story. And so you're jumping into the middle of the story if you haven't heard it before, and I encourage you afterwards, if this is of interest to you, to jump into the MOJOE.studio podcast area and pick up some previous episodes. So John, tell us, where are you right now, and lead us down the path.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah. Well, we are, last time in episode 5, we were introducing a second narrative. And so we had talked about a first narrative, which looked at basically the entirety of history, shall we say, but through a lens that, in the concept of looking at things through, a double-edged lens of sorts. I literally believe that the Earth is, I looked this up, by the way, Joe. It's 4.5 billion years old, roughly, as according to science. And I believe in science and think that it's literally 4.5 billion years old. But when I took that idea of a very, very kind of fundamentalist, and I say that respectfully, a fundamentalist view of a 6,000-year-old young Earth, that revealed, and I believe that to be figuratively true, and I underline both words, figuratively true, that 6,000-year framework revealed some patterns and stories that are really, really rich and worth looking at. And the first one was that as 6,000 years divides into 3 2,000-year chunks. And just super briefly, it's that at the Tower of Babel, God created diversity, and shortly thereafter that, he established a covenant with Abram, which became Abraham, and that foreshadowed Jesus Christ, with Abraham having to put Isaac on the sacrificial altar. But then God let Abraham and Isaac off the hook. But then God did not let himself off the hook 2,000 years after that with Jesus Christ. And then in Revelation, you have this: every nation, tribe, and tongue will worship together. And it's the coming back to the garden from the Babel dispersal with Jesus Christ right in those central key points. And that establishes this pattern that, all of this stuff that we argue about and wrangle over, it's understandable that we do. Satan does not want it to come back together. And that's what we then see over and over again, and it's what we argue about over and over again. And I'll be bold enough or, blunt enough to say, people have to get their heads around then this diversity stuff and value it. It doesn't mean that it can't be refined and done better. But if you're pushing back against it, I think that you're pushing back at things larger than you realize. It's not just some person that drives you crazy. You may be arguing with God more than you realize. So, heading into a second one then, and there's lots of narratives we could look at, but narrative, story, it's all pattern, and that's how we learn things. It's why Jesus taught in parables and all that stuff. There was this second one, and we were kind of excited to go through this idea that in the mid-1400s, Gutenberg invented a printing press. And a lot of people might say, wait, what? But no, that's important. You kind of ought to know that. Because it does. It impacts everything. It was the dispersal of information. And the first thing that he prominently printed was the Bible. And the Bible went out and exploded into the world again. It mirrors creation. That the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God and was with God, and it exploded into creation. And then it did it again with Gutenberg in the 1400s. And that led to amazing advances in, it's called the Renaissance, for heaven's sake. It's called the Renaissance, and that means being reborn or born again. And it's all of these advances in culture and art and science and all these wonderful things. And then it's also the age of discovery. And that's really big and important, but it's also gnarly. Because the age of discovery, even that phrase, is obviously and very westernized and European perspective. To African people, we did not discover Africa, or to Native American people, we did not discover the Western Hemisphere. It's just to our perspective, our European Western perspective. It is a part of what I think God is trying to do to bring everybody back together, but then also, just like creation, Satan tried to get in there immediately. Like Satan shows up early in Genesis. And Satan showed up immediately after the Bible did this second explosion. Yes, the age of discovery then is fraught with peril. And we could go down a million rabbit trails. There's a lot, and it needs to be talked about. It is being talked about. We're talking about the evils, frankly. I need to say the evils of colonialism. But then also, what else could be happening there? It is tied to the Great Commission and missionaries wanting to go out and to share that word. And that's important. And those are difficult questions. I don't even quite want to go there today, because those are like endless conversations that can go for hours and hours and hours and hours at the least. And in a way, we've seen over and over and over again that it's very difficult to find a resolution on them. I actually, though, want to go somewhere a little bit different with it that I think is actually clarifying. So as that narrative goes forward, that's roughly a 600 year, we're coming up on, I guess, okay, I can do the math pretty quick. It's like a 580 year narrative that divides into kind of 200-year chunks a little bit. And as I was working through this and thinking through it, I was like, well, that means then about 200 years after the 1440, 1450 era, something big must have been happening. And that is in the early 1600s. And you might say, yeah, I don't really know anything that happened in the early 1600s. But monster important things were happening in the early 1600s into the mid 1600s. And what that is the Holy Roman Empire was losing its grip over nation states in the 30 Years' War, I think is what they called it. And I hardly know anything, or hardly knew anything about the 30 Years' War. It's not taught a lot, but it was this really, really important thing. And I think there is godly value in that I don't think God wants strictly a theocracy under man. He can run a theocracy himself when he comes back, but we're not supposed to have a theocracy. I don't think that's what God wants. It gets messed up too easily. And the Holy Roman Empire was losing its grip politically in that 30 Years' War, but it builds to a head, and these are all interconnected. I think it's around 1640, which is about 200 years exactly after Gutenberg, England then, which had already broken away from the Catholic Church with the English Reformation. Oh, I didn't even mention the German main Reformation there, which we could get into, but that's a part of those endless conversations. I want to focus on, I think, these things that are often overlooked, but can clarify. King Charles I in England insisted that he had a divine right to rule, that he was basically divinity. And the people in England said, no, that's a problem. You can't claim to be actually divine. And he said, no, I am. That's what it says. That's what everybody thinks. I'm sticking to it. And they said, we can't have you doing that. If you insist, we're going to have to call you an enemy of the state, and we're going to have to execute you. And he said, well, I'm not budging. And they said, okay. And they did execute him. Now, let me be very clear. I am not then saying, oh, good, God wanted that to happen. Oh, good, God likes capital punishment. I'm not saying those things at all. But I will say that the state has been given and has been understood to have been given the power to do that if it deems it necessary. I don't even know exactly how I want to. If I were in charge, maybe I would do it differently. We could talk about that. It's endlessly talked about. But that power of the state to do that established itself then. And kings and queens the whole world over said, oh, whoa, maybe we have to rethink this whole claim to divinity. And that's a really big deal historically. So I'll
Absolutely.
pause there.
Well, there's a lot there, John, in just a few
It is a
minutes.
lot.
That's a lot. And to back up just a little bit for people who are kind of catching up with us, John has already touched on the fact that there's truth with a big T, and some of that is literal truth, and some of that is figurative truth, and yet it's still truth. And we see this in the earth, we see it in reality, science, math, we see it in the Bible as well. And so some of you may ask, well, why divide up into thirds, right? So why, what's the big magic of thirds? And this goes back to John's film school days, where the stories that really catch in Hollywood, that the stories that we all resonate with and that make a lot of money, are the ones that have a clear beginning, middle, and end, that go through this process. And really, it's a reflection, a human construct, but that reflects the greater reality of history in the biggest sense, for the creation, and then, as John was talking about, these milestones, and they might be a figurative in terms of dividing history up into thirds rather than literal, but doesn't make it any less true. Right. So creation and then the fall of man. So that's the beginning. And then, as John's already talked about, how these things are going. And if you see these milestones along the way, you realize that really is that same story divided into thirds, the beginning, the middle, the end. There's the conflict. We need a resolution. You're going out on a journey and you need someone to help teach you how to get there. All these things that keep bubbling up in the greatest stories, which is part of, we're claiming is part of history. It's our story. It's also his story for those that believe in God, right? So that's why John is looking for these. Is there evidence that if you divide the historical markers up into thirds, that in a story form, that there's evidence that the story is continuing on the big stage, and we're seeing evidence everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, Joe. That it is, that's exactly what we've been talking about, and I do think that it's important to say again too that it's pattern. Its story is pattern, and that's how science knows things, is via pattern, and that's how legal principles are based on finding patterns and things like that. It's how we actually know and find reassurance in things. It's what social media is about. They look at our clicks as a pattern to see what they think we want and where we go next, and that can obviously be abused, and it can obviously cause problems, but it also actually kind of works too. I'm not trying to gloss over all the awful either, but I did actually want to look at that product, or that article actually is interesting to me, and you got to be careful with all that, but it's this power of story and power of pattern. And then the last thing too that I'll just kind of reiterate is that this King Charles I thing, again, a lot of people may say they don't know about it, but it is this thing where this divine right to rule was being challenged, and that actually is appropriate and righteous. Not, again, I'm not saying that, God wants to kill people, but from our very first podcast, Jesus Christ gave a new mandate of servant leadership. Wow. And the abuses of monarchical, tyrannical kings is not okay. And it's not mutually submitted, and it's not servant leadership, and it's not what God wanted. And he said, I'm going to get what I want. And so what we are proclaiming, I think you're in agreement with me, is that, oh my gosh, Jesus Christ's new mandate of servant leadership is what has flowed into what we know as democracy and freedom. And the idea of freedom is, ironically or double-edgedly, mutually submitted. That your freedom only extends to the end of your nose, but it's very important because they have freedom too. Okay.
I wanted to touch on this idea of the theocracy or the divine right of kings. This too is a pattern throughout the history of mankind. Yes. So even even the Israelites, and can't remember if we touched on this or not, the Israelites, when they're nomads at first, and then they're looking for their country, and God takes them to the promised land, they start to demand a king. They plead with God, give us a king, right? And God's reluctant. God's like, I don't think that's a good idea, because he knows the nature of man, and he knows, as we have all found out, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, right?
Absolutely.
So God's holding off. He's like, I don't know, no, I can be your king. Why don't you just serve me, right? That's going to be better for you. They're like, no, give us a king, give us a king. So God's like, all right, well, that wasn't really my plan, but here you go. And then it all goes haywire, right? Because the king feels like, I'm in power. I'm in charge. Everybody does what I want, and they have to do what I want by the rule of law. And so whether it was overt or internal, they assume this divine right, that I've got the absolute power, and they forget to submit to the person that put them in power in the first place. And then this happens over and over throughout history. And my former pastor was talking about when Jesus was born, one of the profound things that Jesus was saying is he was poking at the rulers of the time who too had this sense of divinity. They would proclaim, I am the ultimate, I'm the and all and the be all, and you have to do what I say or you're dead, right? And Jesus is like, nope, that's not true. I know that's what you think, but that's not true.
Right. Yeah. And so all of this then too, I want to be super clear on this. Like Joe and I have said from the beginning, we know that we're two white guys sitting here talking about this stuff, but it does flow into all of this diversity stuff. And maybe there's worth in us, because people often will say that white people do need to speak up. And it does flow into all those conversations. And that's not where I want to go immediately right now, because that is a million rabbit trails. But what is establishing itself there then with all of that stuff? The breaking down of the Holy Roman Empire politically, and then also the King Charles I thing, is an establishment of a system of law, a system of justice that you can tie, by the way, not just to the Renaissance, which I said was being born again, but the Enlightenment, which many people think is antithetical to God. I don't think it is. It is about the idea of mutual submission and the consent of the governed. And that is vitally important and consistent with Jesus Christ mandating again, saying this servant leadership thing, I'm going to have it. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand me. You don't get me. And that's a big deal. And so what I want to be very clear on then is that what was being established is a justice system that, even though it's taking a long time, it can't abide the sins of colonialism. The sins of colonialism that kind of came with all of that explosion. There was also being established a criminal justice system that now is the most prevalent in the world, that can't abide all of that stuff that happened even 500 years ago. And that to me is actually, glory be to God. And it's obviously very double-edged, and it is very, you've got to find that point, and you've got to work with people to find those points, to find the ultimate point.
Absolutely. In fact, to go back to the servant leadership, I think there's a nuance here too, where you have said very clearly, and I fully support you, that God says, no, I'm going to have it this way. But that can be misinterpreted, even that this is God just forcing his will on us.
Yeah.
God is saying that not for his benefit. Yeah. He's saying that for our benefit.
Absolutely.
He's saying servant leadership is the only way. This is a mandate. You must do it. And when we all push back, don't tell me what I have to do, right? No, I don't have to do anything. And God's saying, no, you don't get it. I'm not forcing you to do my will. I'm saying for your benefit, for the benefit of mankind, for the future of the planet, for the fabric of society, for your heart on an individual basis. This is the only way.
It's the only way to a sense of fulfillment too, because everybody actually knows that. It is actually not fulfilling. It's just simply that we sinfully, whether from fear or greed, which is often rooted in fear, we can't help ourselves. And two, just to be real quick, all of this stuff too, not only is wrapped up in Jesus Christ, but it's also wrapped up in Spider-Man. You know, like Joe and I are not lofty sitting on some holy, ivory tower here. Spider-Man said it too. With great power comes great responsibility, and that duality people don't take seriously enough.
Yeah. So our history is fraught with the Spider-Mans of the world who didn't take the responsibility with the power that they were given. And so
Spider-Man
Jesus addresses Spider-Man, right. And of course, he's the fictitious character that we're all aspiring to.
A superhero.
The Spider-Verse, right? That's really what we're talking about, is the Spider-Man universe, whatever that's called, right?
You're on to something there.
It's everywhere. And the problem is that in our humanity, and so I was going to say the other thing that keeps cropping up that subverts this really ideal way to go that God had designed for us is our ego. And I've talked about this at length, that our ego either inflates our sense of importance and gives us that godlike divinity claim, or by comparison, then we go to the fear that you're talking about, right? We're afraid that we're going to be exposed for the puny little souls that we are. And God's saying neither of those are true. Your identity isn't your ego. Your ego is this false sense of self, and it just gets you in trouble on both sides of that coin. What really matters is my identity in the creator of the universe, who made me and knit me together in my mother's womb, and what he thinks about me. It doesn't matter what I think about me. It doesn't matter what you think about me. And if I could just get over that ego thing, then I could live in servant leadership without the fear of being abused or, all those things.
Yeah. So anyway, Joe and I also want to be mindful of the time. I see we're at 21 minutes now.
Well, this one can actually go a little longer because I can edit it for the podcast later. So it's okay if we go a little long. Yeah.
I do think then, too, that we ought to just finish this narrative off a little bit today. I'm not going to introduce the third one either, but there is a trinity, if you will, or a trio of narratives that I think are helpful. But there are others, because it's unlimited. That the way that we understand things is indeed, again, via story. And that's what's important. And that's what gets lost when you're unwilling to allow that story to be told or to be had. It's why we struggle I don't know if you knew this, Joe, but I think I've seen the polling that history is one of everyone's least favorite subjects, K through 12, but it's one of their favorite subjects once they get to college or enter into maturity. Some of that's just simply maturity, but also some of it is that people politically, they'll argue and they won't allow the story to be told. And that's not to say it ought to be just all left or all right. I'm contending that it is this double-edged duality of it to say, what we'll get to with that third one is America good or bad? Well, it's both. And the both actually clarifies and says that is the way to understand this is, oh my gosh, these ideals are actually, I would say, holy. I'd like to see that even give credit to the Holy Spirit. Wow, great. But, oh my gosh, that makes you a giant hypocrite then. And that's important. And that's clarifying. So 200 years then following that King Charles I, think is a big thing that we all are more familiar with, but is actually at least it helps to understand it on a more international scale. And that's the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War came about 200 years after that. And the great words of Abraham Lincoln was that we're going to show you that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Kings and queens all over the world were hoping that America would dissolve, basically, and go away so that we could get back to normal kings and queens. And it didn't happen. And only by the grace of God, really. And you could dig into a lot of gnarly stuff about Lincoln himself. And I've had enriching conversations with friends, especially African-American friends, about thinking and rethinking Lincoln. But I do think that he is worthy of great admiration. And then that time is worthy of great consideration. And that idea that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, I think God sustained it in the midst of severe pushback, shall we say. And we still see that pushback. We see the exact same pushback, the exact put the same flags. We haven't resolved it, and we probably can't indeed, but we got to keep trying. But yeah, I think that the American Civil War, and I've written, by the way, more on this. I'm not going to just like dive into all of it, but I think that understanding the U.S. Civil War on an international scale is helpful. There's also some stuff about Napoleon that you could dig into in that same time frame there, and I don't want to go there now, and I actually could go further there myself. But I do like that U.S. Civil War on an international scale being that second milestone.
Yeah. So really, a couple things come to mind. One is, and I've mentioned this before, that I recently read a book and fascinated, kind of blew my mind, called Limitless by Jim Quick. And Jim Quick is a guru in using your brain for its full potential, memory, speed reading, all this kind of thing. But he too goes into the science of story, that the way we think, the way we organize our thoughts, the way we remember anything is all around story. And he's taken it just from a purely scientific side of it. So it's another proof of what we're saying is true, and that these patterns are repeating themselves. But now I'm fascinated, of course, with these milestones that you brought up in this conversation. And when I think about the Civil War, that you're right, that has not been resolved, but it did put a stake in the ground saying there is a better way, right? Yeah. Which is exactly what Jesus was trying to say. He's put a stake in the ground saying, you got it wrong, but I'm going to forgive that, but there is a better way, and I'm going to hold you to a higher standard. So even when Jesus forgives the lady that was ready to get stoned, what he did is he let the rest of them know you're no better. We're all a mess in process. But he also said to her, I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. So there's the duality, right? You are forgiven, and you didn't earn it. I forgive you because I'm God and I love you. Yes. But there is a better way, and I think that's the tension we're in even now. Yeah, is that there's a stake in the ground, and whether it's Gutenberg or it's Jesus, and then it's the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and now the Civil War, we keep putting the stakes in the ground, saying there's got to be a better way, and we haven't found it yet, but we're working towards it.
Yeah, definitely. And so just to then kind of layer back over that, I do think there's a reassurance of recognizing these patterns. And yes, Satan tried to get in there immediately after creation. And yes, Satan tried to get in there immediately after this Gutenberg thing. This age of discovery has to be understood from these different perspectives. That's the duality right there. That you have to find a point, but there's validity to these different perspectives. And you have to get your head around that. In fact, we've contended, Joe and I have already said this. This is not, some lofty thing again. Everybody already does this every time you have a conversation with someone. Married people know all about this. We every day are balancing different perspectives. We just don't like to. Right. And so the perspective that, there is goodness, though, in this coming back together, and there is goodness in building towards what God has intended for us and all of that. There is goodness in understanding the founding and all of those ideals that were laid down in such inspirational ways. We have to, though, keep that in mind that we don't just blame Satan then, because we all have the power to say, get behind me, Satan. And that means that, we have to take seriously, good God, the enslavement of African Americans and the genocide, however it happened, the genocide of Native Americans is horrific and has to be dealt with. There's justice involved there. And frankly, we have to look at the planks in our own eyes first. That is the principle that Jesus also laid down, to say, good God, there are justice things that have to happen. But the interesting thing in all of that is, and I'm not going to dive into this now, but it is, I think, a desire for a more perfect union. Most people aren't advocating for actual revolution and do away with the United States of America. They are advocating for America to live up to its ideals and to have a more perfect union and to be willing to keep being reformed. And that doesn't mean then that the reformers can't be refined also. I'm not saying that everything you hear from what you might call another side or whatever is perfect. But don't push back too rigidly, because you may be arguing again with God more than you realize.
Right. So man, this phrase takes on a whole new light. A more perfect union. There's even process built into that.
Yes.
It's a discovery, like you said. It's a progression, and I think we could apply that exact same principle, well, to almost any relationship, of course, but
Yes.
to the church. It's easy for us to expose the weaknesses of the church, and you see it everywhere on social media. And a lot of people that I knew that grew up in the church, they can't stand it anymore because it fights against this. What they sense is that some churches or the church in general has put the stake in the ground, saying we've got it right, we've got it together,
Right.
that's not true either. It's
Right.
this process where whether we're an individual or we're a group or we're a team or we're a tribe, if it becomes an us versus them, and we
Yep.
say, oh, we've discovered the truth and we are living up to it, it's that's not even true at all, because the other side can easily say, are you kidding me? You are a
Yeah.
hypocrite. I mean, you hear that word
Right.
all the time. You're a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And just a little side trail here. When my little brother was really young, he was riding in the car, and my mom slams on the brakes because somebody pulled out in front of us. And my little brother, at age 4, he says, "What a hypocrite!"
Yeah.
And we all look at the back seat and said,
Where'd you learn that
"Hypocrite,
word?
Ken?" Yeah. Do you know what that word means? He goes, "Oh yeah, it's some kind of frog." And we laughed and we laughed.
That's good.
But anytime any of us in any group, in any identity, say we understand,
Yeah.
and then, which may or may not be true, and then to say, and we are embodying it or living it out, we're already a target, because it's a process. We're
Yeah.
going from glory to glory, the Bible would say. We
Yeah.
got to keep getting
Yeah.
drawn towards the answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that just, it's worth saying again too, that like you and I are in agreement on this, that we're not, like, I'm providing a lot of what may seem like I think are, or could arguably be called, I think I know the answers, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you have to commit to being reconciled and reconciling across these divides. And that means that I don't know it all. And that means that I can learn from that perspective. And I do have to check myself. But it doesn't mean, completely, divorcing myself from whatever it is that I do think. It just means check it and work together to find that greater good, and trust that, yeah, God will lead us there, and that God is leading us there, frankly. Because you can get into that too, that we are making progress. I would argue we turned a corner even this year. And that's just a corner. We've been doing it for at least 50 years, and we could talk about, in fact, we will. That's a good segue into what we will talk about going forward. All of this flows then directly into the gnarliness of American history, which is what the third narrative is then. And it's on the front pages all the time. And I'm just contending that, yeah, there is an obvious and a better way to understand it, that the church needs to be actually much more at the forefront of, and not ignoring or whatever.
I think another framework that I've mentioned before that's really helpful, that overlays, again, this whole thing that we're saying, is the idea that change is really a three-part process. The change is hard at the beginning. It's messy in the middle, but it's beautiful in the end. That's the meta story we're talking about. And I think, to go back just one step in our conversation, the problem can be when we think we've already got to the beautiful part and we don't realize we're still in the messy part, or we're not willing to admit we're in the messy part because makes us too insecure. But change has begun. There's no doubt about that. Changes are being made, but we're in the middle part still. We're in the messy part. And yes, we're making progress towards beautiful, which is when God will reconcile us all back to himself, and we will return to the perfection of Eden that he intended us for in the beginning. And I even, for those who may say, I don't believe in the Garden of Eden, nor do I believe in heaven, I love C.S. Lewis when he says, have you ever gone to a place time on this vacation and you think it's going to be the most beautiful place? It's going to be like heaven on earth, right? That's kind of the phrase that we use. And so you pack up all your stuff and you go on your honeymoon. I took my wife to Tahiti for our honeymoon. She'd never been. I'd been once before. And I mean, this is going to be spectacular. It's going to be awesome. And it was beautiful on so many levels. But the truth is, after a few days, it's just another place on earth. It's a really beautiful place, but it doesn't fill that really deep longing. Like I'm gonna arrive, right? This is gonna be everything I ever dreamed of. And C.S. Lewis would say that dream inside is the echo of Eden that we got kicked out of because of our own faults and failures and mistakes. And we're all longing to get back there. That's kind of like a residual proof that we're made for something more, something better. And here we are in the messy part, and we want to jump ahead and say, no, I've got it together. I understand it. And you should believe what I believe. No, we're not there yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet.
I think too, and this is something Joe and I've said, and we could say it again, but that, there are edges and points and realities to all these fuzzy thoughts. And that what you're saying there, Joe, is, I'll say the fuzziest, is that, there's a God-shaped hole inside of all of us. And that Tahiti is beautiful, and you physically were there, and it is physically beautiful, and it's awesome. It's awesome. I've never been there, but I've seen pictures, and I've been to Hawaii, and it's awesome. But the beautiful Edenic place that we want to be in is in fellowship with God and in fellowship with other people. And that is the reality. That is the reality, not just simply a palm tree. A palm tree is great, but it's also, rats like to live in palm trees, for heaven's sake. It's in a proper, mutually submitted fellowship with your neighbor and under God's submission is where you will find that Eden.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense that God said the two greatest commandments are love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself.
Yes.
Because he knows that it's in that space that we're going to find our true identity. That's what we were made for, is relationships. Right. Relationships with our Creator, relationships with the others that God has put us in this world with. And it's profound, it's awesome, it's amazing, it's mind-blowing, and it's truth.
Yeah, we don't want to repeat too many things, but it's worth repeating that one. I think that Joe and I, truly, we are aware that this stuff can be difficult to grapple with. And we've agreed, you can say again if you want, but I think we've agreed. Yeah, there is something called moral relativism in the world, and we can say boo to that. Boo relativism. But guess what? Relationship and the literal truth of relativity ain't that far away from relativism. You've got to take this stuff seriously. Relativism bad, but relativity is real, and relationship is real. And it's this thing that we still argue about, but it's God's going to have his way in the end.
Yeah, that's right. And not just for his benefit, but for ours. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So as we bring this episode to a close, which has been another fabulous step along the journey, I want to step back just to where you said, this God-shaped hole. This is a Blaise Pascal theory, that we all got this God-shaped vacuum. Well, the scripture really says that too, that there's eternity in our hearts. It's pretty hard to understand. What does that mean, eternity in our hearts? But I like, at one point, I thought that this God-shaped hole was just like a round hole in a square peg, and you just couldn't make it fit right? Because you're trying to fill the hole with something else. But I heard it much better put, that the God-shaped hole, if it's God, it's huge, it's limitless, it's this enormous, unfathomable hole, and we try to put puny things in it, like a palm tree and the ocean, or maybe even a person or a family or a country even. But it's this little teeny thing that rattles around in this God-shaped vacuum. It never is going to fill it up, and these things are all finite, so they're not going to last forever. So we're trying to find fulfillment and identity and purpose in a huge vacuum with these little teeny puny limited things, and it can only be filled with God, because that's the size that the hole is, and it's all inside. So we look outside for fulfillment, we look outside for purpose, we look outside for affirmation, and it's in here, because the God-shaped hole is in here, which is exactly what we're saying about the church. The church isn't a building, it's not a structure. That's where you go there to get fed, perhaps, or you get reignited, or you get excited, and it's almost like the Hot Wheels racetrack, where the car goes down and starts to die, and then it goes through that station where the wheels are spinning, right?
Yes.
And then it goes shoo, shoo, and it takes off the other side. That's what the church is intended to be. It's like to get the juice back in and send you back out. That's where the mojo is. To get you going. It's not to park there. It's not to stay there, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So this is awesome stuff. Good stuff.
And it really is good. Like we are finishing up, but it is. It can be very lofty, and like you mentioned Blaise Pascal there, and that's great. But was it Carrie Underwood that also sang that song? It's a God-shaped hole inside of all of us. I mentioned Spider-Man. And then too, it's the gospel according to Hot Wheels, for heaven's sake.
Right, exactly.
It is all around us.
It is.
You know,
And that's a great, just a little side note that some of these episodes in my podcast are with my other friend Lee Free, and his whole book is about God moments, where just like you said, whether it's Spider-Man or Hot Wheels or Carrie Underwood, God is everywhere. If we really truly believe that God is infinite, he's everywhere all the time, then of course he's going to be in Spider-Man, and he's going to be in Hot Wheels, and he's going to be in Oreo cookies, or because there's the three pieces. There's like the trinity of cookies, right?
Yeah.
So
And it's racial reconciliation right there, Joe. Oreos are, and that can be actually a little bit provocative, but actually, yeah.
So I just want to thank everybody for spending some time with us today, or wherever it is and whenever you tune in. One thing I really love about that we're doing this is that once it's recorded and it's posted, it's available for anybody, anytime, anywhere around the world that's got a connection. And so I just want to say a quick prayer that God will take what we've discussed and use it for his purposes, so that he'll get us further along this major changes we need to make from hard to messy to beautiful, and that we'll take as many people with us as we can, right? And that's in the name of our God and for his glory, because he knows what's best for us. So from Joe McCarthy, Mojo, and John Comfort, JC, thanks for tuning in, and join us again when we get our act together and go to the next episode. Have a great day, great week.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to see if I can close this out.